never know to whom you're talking. When I speak about domestic violence, I always know there are people listening to me who know more about it than I do. They've lived it. It was in their families when they were children. One of their adult children might be experiencing it. Someone here may have escaped from a violent relationship years and years ago. Someone here might be facing these issues even now. When I first worked for the Mid-Peninsula Support Network, that was very unusual. There were very few shelter-sponsored men's programs in the United States and even in California. And the director of the time, who has since died, Jerry Rivard, who was a really good person, caught hell from other shelters around the state for diverting money to pay for a man to work with those guys. Maybe the money could be better spent getting play therapists for the children. It's a legitimate argument. On the other hand, stopping it where it starts could be a good way to approach it too. When I was first working there, after a short time, I had an epiphany. I saw a middle-aged woman in a supermarket wearing sunglasses. It was 9 o'clock at night. And I suddenly thought, excuse me, this was 35 years ago. I thought, is she one too? And I realized we're in an epidemic that had been invisible to me. At the shelter, I think we felt like we were underground guerrillas, leading a culture change, disrupting the dominant paradigm. I've called this effort today Beyond Power and Control because domestic violence is much more than make me a sandwich, give me a beer, have sex with me. The power and control the batterer exercises is bidirectional. On the one hand, the effect on the victim is that she is forced by several means to internalize the batterer's standards for her feeling, thinking, and conduct. In these ways, the batterer invades and colonizes her thinking. The other way this is beyond simple power and control, is that the batterer hijacks her ego functions to serve him where his ego functions are deficient. And he does that by requiring her to contain his intolerable affect. Now I want to go to another issue. Men are battered in straight relationships, in gay relationships. Some lesbians experience domestic violence as well. For efficiency, I'm not going to use triple pronouns so that I don't offend anybody. I'm going to say victim and perpetrator. I will also say she and he because in my experience, the victim is usually female and the perpetrator is usually male. Of course, we all know this is not always the case. So I'm going to move quickly through this. I want to ask you to hold questions until the end. And so here we go. What is domestic violence? The wide range of abusive acts, verbal, emotional, cognitive, psychological, a wide range of physically violent acts. And many of these acts are not criminal, but it's very hard to make them be defined as criminal. And I'll come to that later. The purpose of that is to create in the abused person a mental state of fear, dependency, confusion, and isolation, and to reduce that person to servitude with the batterer as the beneficiary. The difference is, how this is different from an assault by a stranger, is that these people know each other very well. They may be intimate, they may know each other's place of work, they may know each other's routes of getting to work, they may know each other's PIN codes for their electronics, for their banks, they know each other's personal history, family of origin history, they may know each other's personal vulnerabilities and family secrets. So unlike an assault in the parking lot of a 7-Eleven, people so situated can really harm each other just with the knowledge that they have, if they so choose. Now, I want to talk about the personal and cultural context of the abused. And the whole thing with understanding domestic violence is you have to expand the context. You have to bring things into the context. You have to situate the bad behavior in its larger context. I know from the court work I've done that the defense attorneys, when the batterer is accused, their job is to narrow the context, to isolate this act. And so somebody has said to me something like, well, Mr. Ferry, if I slam a door, does that make me a batterer? The context is everything. No, probably not. It doesn't make me a batterer, and I have slammed the door at least once in the last 10 years. What it means when I slam a door is this interaction is over, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. It doesn't happen very much. In these families, slamming a door is just a comma or a semicolon on the route to serious escalation. So the context is everything. Personal factors of the victim. And these are really a double-edged sword, as you'll see. Hope or optimism, mental or emotional stamina, the quality of the attachment to the abuser, her fear of retaliation by the abuser, her belief in his ability to carry out his threats. Demographic factors include physical or mental disability status, access to resources in order to leave the abuser, and the presence of children. It's much harder to escape when you have children. Cultural and ethnic factors would include the perception of available social support. For many people, leaving their partner under any circumstances is anathema. It's because many people have very strong beliefs about marriage and divorce. And also, so that leaving can cost them support and warmth within their cultural group, whatever that may be. Also, some cultural subgroups have beliefs about women that are very hard to swim against. Now, another way of looking at this is to think in terms of strategies used and not used by the abused. Personal strategies would be private. That would include educating herself, restraining her reactions, convincing herself that she's at fault. This is a cognitive trick, but it is a way of managing from, it's like having power when there is no power. Accepting the abuser's point of view and not debating and actually being convinced of it. Blaming herself for the problems, which is very, very common. And prayer, something as quiet as prayer or meditation, are ways that many victims use. Informal strategies include confiding to family members, soliciting advice from family members, leaving the abuser for brief periods, and asking the abuser, stop doing this. Formal strategies involve going to a therapist, having legal intervention, calling the police, going to a shelter, applying for welfare, calling the police, getting a restraining order, and finally getting a divorce. So now it's important to realize that the use or non-use of any of those strategies doesn't mean that there isn't violence or that the person being abused doesn't mind. All right. So let me go on to some common misconceptions. Alcohol and substance abuse cause domestic violence. Actually, it's much more subtle than that. It can facilitate the loosening of inhibitions, and it accompanies about 50% of the incidence of domestic violence. But it works in a couple of ways. In many cases, the abuser requires the victim to drink along with him, with phrases like, well, you think you're better than me, so you quit drinking. And they're very threatened by that. Also, the battered woman may drink to ease her physical pain and may drink to numb herself emotionally. So, and then of course that gets turned around against her as a weapon to bash her with in the court or in a custody process. Yeah. It's bidirectional, its effect on her. One, it becomes an excuse to beat her up verbally, and she drinks because she gets beat up verbally and physically. A couple of other things. Battered woman syndrome is an obsolete concept. There are three reasons why. Those are that syndrome has a halo effect of it's a medical condition or a mental condition. The other is that syndrome means that the symptoms are pretty much the same for everybody. So if I have an upper respiratory infection, I probably have 4 out of 6 symptoms. Someone else here who has that has another 4 of those 6 symptoms, but they will certainly overlap. And if you have symptoms outside of that definition, then you might not have an upper respiratory condition. Now, why that matters is in terms of the services available to battered women and the how they're handled in the court. If they don't meet a very narrow definition, they may not get the kind of help that they need, like having somebody to accompany them and other things. The third reason is that men are battered. So battered woman syndrome leaves out a lot of people. The other concept that I consider to be obsolete, although not everyone does, is the concept of learned helplessness. This came from Lenore Walker, and she's observing on Seligman's studies with dogs, inducing passivity in the dogs and shocking them and all that stuff. Another way to look at the, and the dogs, failed to escape from the electrified cage, etc. A way to understand battered women failing to take action on their own behalf, and that's what that refers to, is that it's not that they're passive dummies. It may be that they're strategically keeping a low profile. They're carefully avoiding provoking the abuser. And that may require going back after leaving. It may require, in her estimation, thwarting prosecution by recanting in court under oath. So the thing there is, battered women often, victims of violence in a relationship of entrapment, often do things that are paradoxical. They don't make sense. They're not commonsensical. My contention is, if we don't understand what they're doing, how it fits into something, we're not looking deeply enough. Also, the presence or absence of PTSD or its younger, smaller sibling, ASD, are not defining features of battered women, of the experience of domestic violence. So going from battered women syndrome to the current phrasing, which is the common experiences in relationships of violence, the relationships characterized by domestic violence. Battered women syndrome is a process, is a label, it is an entity, it's a thing. The common experiences of IPV is a process. It's not the same for everybody. So instead of a status of is you or is you ain't a battered woman, it's more about how the effects of the abuse affect that person and how it evolves over time. Okay, other misconceptions. Battered women are masochistic. That's not true. There is a point where during the cycle of violence, a woman may do something to provoke the abuser. And that is, when I was in graduate school, that's where the study of this problem began, and one of my favorite professors was saying, well, they do things to cause the violence. And we think that they get a strategic upper hand. They get the emotional upper hand by doing that because the poor guy is then flooded with remorse and regret and shame, and he does all these undoing and making up behaviors. Well, that's where they started looking at it. They didn't look upstream from that to see, is there any other way to understand someone who has been beaten before doing something provocative? Yeah, there is. And that is that it is to terminate a period of unbearable tension in the first of the 3-phase cycle of violence. So it's like, all right, I know what's going to happen. It's going to happen within 72 hours. Let's get this over with. So that would be slamming a door, disrespecting his mother, breaking a dish, assaulting him even. So again, context matters. Make-up sex. That's not a reconciliation. It's probably a rape. And many batterers follow a battering episode with what they call make-up sex. They coerce and badger the woman to have sex if she's been beaten up or otherwise terrorized. She's likely to go along with it, partly because it's, rape as routine is one of the features of the sexuality of these couples. The other is that she may be just too exhausted to fight, and the other is that she may need to use sex to tranquilize her partner. So again, the context is she's trying to reduce the risk, reduce her exposure to violence, and she might not welcome having sex while she's got a black eye, but it may be a strategic decision. This misconception that it's make-up sex explains the batterer's tactic, which is just one more way to abuse and dominate. It explains that tactic as if this is the desired outcome that the battered woman wants. It's make-up sex. We're being friends. Some other things. If it was that bad, the victim could just leave. And I'm sure all of you know this, I won't belabor it, but the practical, emotional, and risk assessment involved in can I leave, how will I get out of here, the logistics of getting out with 2 or 3 children are daunting. What if you didn't finish high school and you're 25 and you have 2 children and you're in a minimum wage job and you don't have a car? And that's a common situation here. So there's a certain smug comfort in saying, well, if it's that bad, just get the hell out. Again, context. If it was really happening, the victim would not conceal it. She would tell people. If it was really happening, she would call the police. If it was really happening, she would leave the perpetrator. If it was really happening, she would never reconcile with him. So it must not have happened. Think of the function of these misconceptions, not the content. The function is it deflects our attention away from the obnoxious behavior of the abuser toward nitpicking and fault-finding on the battered woman. Why do they stay? It's difficult to grasp because they don't act the way we think they should. They don't act the way we think we would if we were in the same situation. One way they stay is fear of retaliation. After the police leave, at the end of the legal proceedings, after he gets out of jail, fear of stalking, assault, murder. The partner will find them and has probably said that to her many times. She may need tangible resources that are only available through the relationship with the abuser. She may need non-financial help with the children. Children need a father. Even a violent father is better than no father. The victim blames herself for his conduct. Her personal strengths, hope, and optimism can be misdirected to believe that more effort and more love will finally get through and change him. There's a sort of well, I'll have more to say about that later. The victim's pursuit of the sunk costs of the relationship. She spent all this time, emotional energy, etc., set up a home with this person. It's very hard to just walk away and abandon that. Those are sunk costs, and people don't want to abandon their sunk costs, or things have to get really bad before people abandon their sunk costs. She may have continuing feelings of love, and that may be authentic love. She may really love him in spite of all this stuff, which doesn't make sense to many people, but it's a true experience. And again, the cultural and religious prohibitions and the fear of loss of social support, those are very powerful inhibitors. Now I'm going to talk about the cycle theory of violence. This was put forth. It's a useful concept, and it probably occurs in about half of domestic violence relationships. The ones that don't have a cycle, that do have severe violence, are really characterized as with periods of dull tension, ongoing tension, and unpredictable explosions, spikes of violence that are terrifying and can be very, very injurious. The people who live in those situations refer to it as a state of siege. In this cycle theory, I'll very quickly go through this. I suspect everyone here is familiar with it. This was from Lenore Walker, her 1979 book, The Battered Woman. In the tension-building phase, the interactions get more strained, they get more abrupt. The battered woman may engage in either two micro-strategies. One is to placate and appease. This would be sex when he wants it, his favorite pancakes for breakfast, invite his parents over. The other micro-strategy is to avoid contact. This would be to reduce contact, so there's one-sentence paragraphs, one-word sentences, and then silence, and actually moving out of the room where he is. The idea there is to avoid accidentally provoking the abuser by saying the wrong thing in this backdrop of tension, mounting tension. Paradoxically, what that does is it stimulates the abuser's underlying fears of abandonment. So it actually, while it's a conservative action to restrain random acts, it actually fires him up at a level that he's not conscious of. So in the cascade of emotions and cognitions that accompany a spike in his abandonment issues, he can easily go to violence. So it's at this point in the first phase, the tension-building phase, that some women will engage in a provocative act in order to terminate the state of tension. The acute violence phase, we don't need to say much about that. That's the middle stage. If this was a sine wave, this would be the top third, I guess. And, we've all seen stuff in the news, so we don't, it can be everything from a push or a shove or a slam door or, an assault with medical damage. The third phase is the most important for understanding why people stay. That's the remorse phase or the loving contrition phase. And at this point, it's my observation and supported in the literature that the two parties are moving in very different directions. She is either going to be blaming herself, down on herself, etc., or she may be in a posture of more autonomy. And she may be able to say, I'm not going to put up with this. You need to see a therapist. You need to stop drinking. You need to stop running around with wild women. And we need to get marriage counseling. Oh, by the way, you can't hit me anymore. So she may be relatively empowered. Simultaneously, he may have regret, remorse, sorrow, shame. Those are often true emotions, but they're a quarter-inch deep. They evaporate as soon as the sunlight comes over the horizon. And many batterers can feign those emotions for instrumental purposes to convince her. What he does is he makes apologies, he's kind, he listens to her, he's attentive, he compliments her. This is where you might get flowers sent to the office. The other is that he does apologies, makes excuses, blames her for some small aspect of her behavior, and he makes promises all over the place. I'll never hit you again, I'll go to therapy, anything you say, babe. And the third thing, accompanying his urgent begging that she not leave, which many of them experience as debasing, and later act out their resentment at debasing themselves. So all this urgent begging is really stuffing powder into a powder keg for some of these guys. But this is where you get an underlying tone of threat or menace that's maybe covertly expressed, it may be very blatant, undisguised. You better not leave me because I will find you. So, and accompanied with, no one will ever want you, my life has no meaning without you, kind of a veiled suicide threat. We're meant to be together until death do us part, another murder-suicide threat. If you leave, I will follow you. So this really is essentially a campaign of intimidation and seduction. The effect on the victim is that where she may have been more empowered, more autonomous, all this campaign of niceness and kindness, and if you don't look too closely at it, has the effect of reactivate, this is my belief, has the effect of reactivating her early idealizations of her partner. So this is the man I married, that other lunatic has gone away, and the effect of that is to dissolve her resistance, to dissolve her transient autonomy. Now, probably what's happening there for many of these women is a form of splitting, good husband, bad husband, and the difficulty of unifying them both. That defense serves them because they may otherwise be terrified most of the time. They're not consciously doing that. It just seems like, oh yeah, there he is again. I love him. When this is complete, what has happened is he's restored his power. He's back calling the shots. His underlying abandonment fears, shame, humiliation, embarrassment, or his psychopathic lust for power and undoing when he doesn't have power has been tranquilized and put back to sleep. And she is returned to a position of subservience, confusion, and dependency. Without treatment, three things happen. The cycle happens more quickly. What was 1 episode a year becomes 5 episodes a year. The other thing is that the violence itself gets worse. It escalates over 5 years or less. And the third thing is that the third phase, the kindness, the loving contrition, disappears altogether. It gets shorter and shorter and shorter, and finally it's not happening anymore. Yes, okay. So, we think about 8 categories of abuse. I have to tell you, in 1997 I created a questionnaire because I was doing assessments for court cases, family law cases. And I've probably revised that questionnaire 27 times. And it now has over 300 items on it. And often when I do an assessment, I learn of some new way to torment your wife from the women I'm interviewing. So I get educated with this. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time, because we're really pressed for time, giving you examples of these. The categories are financial exploitation, imposing isolation, I will give you some examples after all, using the children, verbal and emotional abuse, threats and intimidation, harassment and stalking, physical violence, and sexual violence. So those are the 8 categories. Financial exploitation would be hiding income, confiscating her income, looting the estate, if there is one, the community property. There's a lot more. Imposing isolation includes many things that are prohibited. Use of the phone, email, going to church, going to school, hanging out with this person or that person, use of the car. I'm going to give you an anecdote here. I worked with a woman in a couple with both were very highly educated. I think she was an attorney, but working for a public agency. And during her second pregnancy, they had a Mercedes-Benz. They had something else as well. And he would take the something else to work and come home. And he prohibited her, 8 months pregnant, from using the other car and required her to take a bus to get to work. That required 2 hours on the bus each way with a bus transfer in the middle. And she just could not budge him on that. He was very cruel in other ways as well. But that's an example of denying transportation, prohibiting the use of transportation. Also, don't call 911 or I'll beat you up. Don't call 911 when I beat you up or I'll beat you up again. The other main subcategory there is surveillance, and this would be opening her mail, pirating her emails, redirecting her emails, putting tracking devices on the car, technology abuse, a very important category, damaging, confiscating electronics, rerouting phone and emails, disrupting service, activating service without her knowledge, activating her location services, or doing things, and there's a lot of very smart engineers here that can do stuff like this, to turn her cell phone into a spying device. So somebody could be listening to everything we're saying here, and we might not know it. Okay, so I'll stop there. But there are exotic ways to torture somebody with electronics. Using the children, shaming the kids, being excessive discipline to coerce her, calling her names in front of the children, undermining her parenting, like, oh, you don't have to go to bed now, you can stay up till midnight. Let's watch this TV show. Okay, I'm going to go on. Oh, after a separation, using the children to spy on her in defiance of a court order. Verbal and emotional abuse includes controlling the use of her time, requiring absolute obedience to made-up rules, on-the-spot rules, silent treatment, unilateral major decisions, no consultation, slandering her, gaslighting. Does everybody know where that comes from, that phrase? Yes, okay, good enough. I can spare 30 seconds, I don't have to do that. Eliciting guilt, intimidating, abandoning during travel, lock her out of the house, threaten to reveal private disclosures. Maybe she was molested as a child and she never told anybody. He threatened to tell people. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Oh no, there's another one. Ridiculing appearance. I'm working with a very affluent woman who's, I'm not taking questions until the end, whose husband is also very affluent. And he has ridiculed all her choices of clothes since before they were married. And at one point, he and his friends thought they were being helpful, gathered up all of her stuff and gave it to Goodwill while she was at work. And so she comes home and her closet is empty. And then he makes a big fuss over, go buy anything you want, dear. We can afford it. And they could. So one of the things she bought was this fabulous pair of boots that were tooled and high above the knee and had this beautiful, imagine a fabulous pair of boots. And she also bought a very hot black cocktail dress. I can't put it on, it doesn't do so much. But both of those things he hated. And he disparaged them, and he threatened to throw them away, and he would make these snorting, disapproving noises when they would go out and she would wear that stuff, until somebody of a higher status than he fawned all over her about these wonderful boots and that really hot black cocktail dress. You look marvelous, darling, marvelous. Then it was okay. He stopped his campaign because somebody of higher status approved of stuff that he previously didn't approve of. All right, moving on. Threats and intimidation. There's a whole lot more than verbal and emotional, but I want to keep moving. Threats and intimidation. Threatening to leave, divorce, to bleed you dry in the court processes, to make you homeless, to ruin your life. False claims to immigration among immigrant families. Interesting recent case, without too much demographics. The wife, refused to cooperate with prosecution of what would have been a misdemeanor violence. And she was aware it would get him deported if it could if he was convicted. So as a gift, as a holy gift to him, she thwarts prosecution, she refuses to show up, she tells the DA, I'm not going to do it, you're on your own, take it or leave it. And the case dies. 2 weeks later, he makes a complaint of domestic violence against her. And it was totally bogus. But right now, she's still waiting to see if the district attorney is going to prosecute her for these lies. Her gift of thwarting prosecution, she was of the belief, and this happens a lot, not just about thwarting prosecution, but this is such a gift that he really needs, because he could lose his job, get sent back to where he came from, blah, blah, blah. That if I thwart prosecution, he will be forever grateful to me. He'll see what a good person I am and will fall in love again. And she totally believed that. And I and her lawyer advised her not to thwart prosecution. She did. 2 weeks later, he's gotten her charged with something. Now, add insult to injury. he has a green card and she is his sponsor. He pulled her sponsorship. So she's subject to deportation. And they're both very highly educated and well employed. So, okay. Okay, let's go on. Well, the threats also would include threats to kill. If you tell, threats to kill the children, that's pretty extreme. Harassment and stalking, obscene phone calls, letters, text, calls, unwelcome gifts, bizarre objects. Very quick anecdote. Approaching Valentine's Day, they've broken up. There's a package when she gets home. She opens it up. It's this beautiful, lacy, frilly heart that you might expect to find candy in it. Inside, there's a red taffeta pillow with lace on it with a steak knife in the heart. It's a heart-shaped pillow with a steak knife through the heart that he sent her, and of course denied it. No, I wouldn't do that. All right, so, okay, I'm going to keep moving, try to keep moving. My questionnaire in the section about physical violence has 63 or 64 ways people can be hideously cruel to each other. But they go all the way from slamming doors, breaking down doors to get at her, push, shove, slap, punch, kick, strangle, pulling hair, spitting on the victim, and spanking the victim. Using a method of discipline that's normally reserved for children and is generally falling out of favor among many people, it is a very degrading thing to treat her like a child and to inflict pain on her. And the woman with the boots, her husband did that to her. So there's a number of things here. Throw food, liquid to scald, burn with a cigarette or a hash pipe. Targeting certain body parts. Some men target breasts or vaginas with kicking or pinching or biting. Preventing her from having an abortion, requiring her to have an abortion, hiding her birth control. So the theory there is if she has another baby, I'll have access to her for the next 18 years. She'll never escape. That's the best way to keep her in prison. Strangle or suffocate, denying her medical attention. Okay, I'm going to stop with that. It just gets awful. Sexual violence, shaming about sexual history, boasting about affairs, negative comparisons to other partners, previous partners, ridiculing her appeal, ridiculing her body, sexual name calling, homophobic name calling, requiring her to watch pornography, wear explicit clothes she doesn't want to wear, be naked when she doesn't want to, do all kinds of sex, different kinds of sex that she may or may not want. She may not want it, or she might. It may not be that the practice is so exotic that it's appalling. What people negotiate to do, as long as it's informed consent between adults, that's fine. But one might not want to have anal intercourse 7 nights a week, for example. Maybe some is okay, but that's a way of abusing. Requiring her to do prostitution. I've had a couple of women that came to me through publicly funded agencies that have been professional sex workers, and they're very sad, and they're complex, very complex cases, very defended, and yet at the same time terribly damaged from a crazy childhood. And that's all I'm going to say about that. All right, so traumatic bonding. This is a concept that many of you are familiar with. Basically, it is where there's a power differential, and the more powerful one intermittently harasses, abuses the less powerful one. And the results of that are that the less powerful one will bond to the more powerful one. The less powerful one will feel dependent, helpless, childlike, and inadequate in the absence of the more powerful one. She may come to despise others of similar status, And the most important piece about traumatic bonding is that she will unconsciously study and discern his values, beliefs, and preferences, and those will crowd out her authentic values, beliefs, and preferences. So I'm going to skip a lot of stuff here. The upshot of that is when battered women are acting against their own best interests, it's possible, it's likely that the process, the cognitive processes of traumatic bonding have taken over. So her experience of doing things that are not in her best interests is based on the gradual erosion of her values, beliefs, and preferences, and her gradually absorbing, drinking in his. She then experiences it as autonomous and internally generated. When it's clear to outsiders, this is imposed on her. So I think that's enough. No, it's not. 4 examples. Neglected, abused, molested children prefer to remain with the abuser rather than be taken away. Cult members, like think of the Jonestown suicides or the Heaven's Gate suicides in San Diego. Those people were probably bonded to a charismatic, abusive leader. The third is hostages. Now, we have the phrase Stockholm Syndrome. That actually is an interesting story. But basically, 2 guys were robbing a bank in Stockholm. They were found out in the process. They took 6 employees hostage and herded them into the bank vault. Now, there, they had weapons. They screamed and hollered about how they were going to kill the hostages if anyone didn't do what they said. And they were the sole control of information coming in. Using that control and having frightened them with their guns, they convinced them that the Stockholm police wanted to get the bad guys so badly that they would kill the hostages to get at them. And they convinced them of this. And so the hostages came to identify their survival with helping the bad guys evade capture. And so, cutting to the chase. Ultimately, the cops drilled a hole in the top of the vault, flooded it with tear gas, everybody got out, nobody was injured. And hence we have the phrase Stockholm Syndrome. Patty Hearst is another example. Information about traumatic bonding was offered at her trial. It did not generate any help for her. But there are 2 factors. First, she was repeatedly abused, and that included physical abuse, threats of murder and rape. And second, she had no alternative information. She had no other way to interpret what was happening to her. The fourth, and this can be very long, I'm going to be very brief though. 2 sets of hostages. Some Jews during the Holocaust. This was reported by Bruno Bedelheim, who has a very controversial reputation, and many think he was a highly accomplished liar. He claimed to have interviewed 1,500 people in the very brief time that he was in a concentration camp before he came to America. I kind of don't think the Nazis gave him a desk and an interview room so he could do this. But he probably did observe this phenomena, but he was an incredible self-promoter. There's a book about him, a biography, The Invention of Dr. B. It's well worth reading. Okay, so he says that that very traumatic bonding thing was happening with some of the Jews who had been observant, devout. They, over the stress of captivity and the abuse of the guards, they came to identify with the guards. So they accepted the stereotypes about Jews that the Nazis propagated. They squabbled over cast-off uniform parts. You'd think, oh, that's so they can disguise and walk out. No, it's much more subtle. It's like they needed the mantle of protection that the uniform parts represented. And another illustration there is that he probably witnessed Bedelheim, an SS guard, or I don't know if it was the SS that guarded the places, but they were really bad people, came into one of the huts, and these were, you've all seen pictures, and as he came in, he wiped his feet before he came in. And the people observing this decoded it as, he really likes us. He just can't say it. We can trust him. Well, actually, the guy was probably obsessive compulsive, and he wipes everything. But they saw it as, that's a courtesy to us. We're okay. So they wanted to borrow protection from them. And the analytic concept is identification with the aggressor. All of those people were murdered when the camps were liberated by other inmates who despised them for selling out. The last one is American POWs during the Korean War. Now they had all of the features of traumatic bonding, the power differential, the alternating kindness and abuse, etc., etc. One of the findings there, they were studied and interviewed at length, was that the boys who came, and the brainwashing was successful for many of them, which was a shock, and people couldn't believe that these boys could be led away from American values. The ones who were most easily led away and took the longest to heal from this were kids from authoritarian families. Now the point there is that the authoritarianism is the deal, not the content of the ideology, whether you're a communist or a free market capitalist. That really doesn't matter. The fundamental structure is the compatibility with authoritarianism that allowed these boys to slip into considering themselves communists, learning to sing the Internationale, stuff like that. So, okay, I've already said this, what I was about to say, so I will pass. Now, I want to talk about coercive control. It's a concept that's very similar to traumatic bonding, but it's different in important ways. And so, think of it as a, let me see if I can do this right. Looking at traumatic bonding is more of an atomistic way of understanding a dyadic process. This is both a dyadic process and a social political process, coercive control is. So think of it as a meta concept, an umbrella concept. It's pervasive, it's an ongoing pattern, it's relentless. It weaves through all of the 8 categories of abuse. A metaphor that's useful for understanding that is picture a brick wall. The bricks are the events within the 8 categories of the abuse. The mortar is what holds them together. Without the mortar, you'd have a pile of bricks on the sidewalk. So in thinking about coercive control, much of it is not criminal. Although, just a few years ago, 2012, the, I don't know the government entity, England, revised their domestic violence laws, expanded that to include coercive control. And they're using that language, and there have been people charged under it and convicted for coercive control. The delicacy there is many of those things don't look like crimes, but in fact they are, and they are also supportive of the actual physical crimes. So this is an authoritarian strategy. The abuser interferes with rights and liberties through deprivations and punishments in order to get compliance. So one of the heavy workers on this concept, Evan Stark, considers it a crime against liberty. It's a liberty crime. It can be established without violence. The subjective experience of being in, having coercive control woven around you is of being in an entrapped relationship. It's like being a hostage. Think of this. Coercive control constrains and limits the target's choices, and the target experiences it as negative. Another process is relational influence or persuasion. This is permissive, and it accepts the possibility that the target may choose not to go along with the recommendation. So healthy relationships have relational processes around persuasion. They don't have to rely on coercion. But one of the ways, okay, so I'm going off here. This includes micro-regulation of routine behaviors, invasion of personal space, undermining autonomy, infantilizing the target, humiliation and degradation, deprivation of access to resources. Now, resources include getting to go to the library. They include getting to get up and walk around the block if you so desire. Isolation, intimidation, and the use of violence. Historically, the domestic violence laws and the law enforcement community see domestic violence in an incident-specific way. They see one event at a time. They see they understand the results based on a calculation of how much force and how bad is the injury. That ignores that coercive control is ongoing and cumulative. So consider crimes like taking a hostage, kidnapping somebody, harassment. Everything done in the service of the kidnapping, including feeding breakfast to the kidnappee, is part of the crime. That is a crime. That's part of the crime. The single incident focus and the calculation of force and injury as to weigh the significance of it leaves that out. It ignores the fact that these things in coercive control are cumulative. And when do we have to stop? Okay, all right, I'm on a roll. We'll let the shop evict us. All right, it's ongoing and cumulative. Ongoing, multidimensional, it appears to be routine and has a cumulative effect. So it's the effect on victims is the result of all the prior abuses, not just the most recent abuse. That's referred to as a course of conduct crime. There are three facets: the intentionality of the abuser, the victim perceives the controlling behavior as negative, and the abuser has to be able to deploy a credible threat that's meaningful to the target. So if I was trying to weave coercive control on one of you and said, you know, if you don't do what I told you, I'm going to push you off the Empire State Building tomorrow. Well, that's not a credible threat. We don't have plane tickets to New York City. So I couldn't really do that. So that's a little bit facetious, but the point is it has to be believable. And the threatener, the abuser, has to be able to give that consequence, whatever it is. Micro-regulation is very important. This is where everyday behaviors associated with stereotypic female roles, dressing, cooking, cleaning, socializing, caring for children, sexuality, become the target for judgment, for criticism, for ridicule. Included in that is the invasion of personal space. This is the intrusion into the personal space of somebody. It disregards the separateness of the person. And, okay, I'm going on. All of this is about the expropriation and control of one person by another in order to harvest benefits for the abuser. The successful abuser accomplishes the imposition of his peculiar reality on his partner by shifting the measure of her self-esteem from her assessment of what she's doing in her work, in her life, in her childcare, to his opinion about how she's doing. And to reduce the distress, many women internalize the controls. Now, why that matters is that the controls become portable, very portable. So it doesn't require as much maintenance if she's being her own narc. And then, in terms of trying to explain it to others, making a fuss about small, insignificant abuses, when they are taken in isolation, makes the victim appear to be petty and controlling. When if you think of them all as an ongoing thing, it's actually the abuser who's being petty and controlling. Capitulating to the abuser's demand she participate in his unreality creates self-loathing within the victim when they have a chance to reflect on it. Stark's point, one of Evan Stark's points is that in the coercive control model, what men do to women is less important than what men prevent women from doing for themselves. Now, treatment of battered women. I have a bunch of things and I will try to be efficient here. 4 essential questions. What was the first episode of violence? What was an average episode of violence? What was the worst episode of violence? What was the last episode of violence? In this, you have to ask explicit questions about specific behaviors. So this is not a place for Rogerian listening. You really need to use explicit words like a sex therapist would, partly to help this person ground their own experience. Now, as the abuse victim is hyper alert to the nuances of mood in the batterer, that comes at the cost of redividing her bandwidth, and she is less attuned to her own experience. So part of the treatment is to help them notice more of their own experience, which they've forgotten to do. They've forgotten how to do that out of the need to survive and anticipate the abuser. The use of language by victims is characterized by the defense mechanisms of denial, minimization, repression, suppression, and dissociation. And and they use euphemisms because talking specifically about what's happened to them is too upsetting. So I'll give you a very quick example. Young people, early 20s, living in Pacifica. I'm doing a very thorough interview because she's been charged with a crime. And there's something I learned in the first session. He wouldn't let me study that night. And I'm thinking, well, okay. And she said it again weeks later, and I'm thinking, oh, well, maybe he was playing loud music, blowing marijuana smoke in her face. And so I said, we're finishing the interview series now. And I'm saying, there's one thing I keep wondering about. What did you mean? And she said, oh, he wouldn't let me study. He slapped my face and tore the book out of my hands and threw it against the wall. That's what she meant by saying he wouldn't let me study. So I think my naivety there was somewhat culture-bound and probably class-bound. But know what get definitions. Very important. Okay, in the interviewing, whether it's for an assessment or just in the therapy, you're reactivating memories of some of the worst events of their lives, and so it's not unusual to have intense emotions, physiological symptoms, hyperventilating, flushing, stammering, or, on the other hand, flat affect and dissociation. So that's another issue about one size fits all. It doesn't work that way. Some people, the same person could have, a very hyper-responsive affect one time when you interview and be flat and depressed, almost as if it's not the same person a week later. Also, and some of them get giddy, giggly, and squirming around. And for someone who doesn't know what they're looking at, it would tend to discredit the person who's doing that. It's like, hey, is this funny? I mean, am I missing something? So, again, the victim's reactions are individualized. We can't do one size fits all. And we can't capture her experience with generalizations. Common mistakes working with battered women. Telling the client what to do reproduces the dependent relationship, puts you in the place of the abuser. Except when you sincerely believe she's in danger. Now, there's some controversy about this. Some people think battered women are the best ones able to estimate the level of danger they're in. Other people think, no, they're not, because of the need to minimize, deny, and sugarcoat. They may not assess danger very well. So, now, keep this in mind. Jacqueline Campbell has created a test called the danger assessment. You can look that up. They have a wonderful website. They do training. They do online training. You can get certified in the use of the danger assessment. It reacts to high-end levels of violence more than to the mid-range, but it's a very good lethality estimate. So, telling her what to do, becoming exasperated and impatient, forgetting that clients use splitting to cope, and forgetting the sawtooth progression. This is 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I think Latimer Lennon said that 100 years ago. The point there is that people make progress, and for a number of reasons. One, they get scared of their progress. They step back. And we know that battered women go back to the abuser an average of 5 times before they make a final break. So So how does she resolve the cognitive dissonance of my partner loves me, my partner beats me up? The way to resolve that in shorthand is to blame herself. So think of the 8-year-old boy whose parents are out of control, and the family is a very unpleasant place to be. And the idea that my daddy loves me, my daddy beats me up, you can't put those two in the same paragraph. And so the solution is, I know, it's because I still wet the bed. I'm 8 years old and I still wet the bed. Whew, it's my fault. Daddy's not crazy. So you see this extreme effort to rehabilitate the abuser. And battered women experience that too. They experience it a little bit differently though. Think of toxic hope. This is sugarcoating whatever they've been through in opposition, in defiance of overwhelming evidence that there's going to be more. That rests on 4 poles. The first pole is to consider that the abuse is normal, to normalize the abuse. Now this may be because it was normalized in her family, that's what she grew up with. It may be because the abuser has said to her over and over and over, that's the way it is, babe, you're not going to get any better anywhere else, you better stick with me. The second way to resolve this toxic hope, or the second pole of the toxic hope, is that the abuse is excusable. That is, he was drunk, he was hungover, he lost his job, the poor guy, etc., etc. Make up your own, insert your own excuse here. This can get to the point where she is making up excuses for him. The third pole of the toxic hope is that the abuse is manageable. And this again is a false belief. If I was just more compliant, more obedient, more subservient and supportive, everything would be okay. And the fourth one, very closely related, is the abuse is justified because I am not subservient enough. There's some objectionable aspect about me that he hates. Now, the function of those two, it's manageable and it's justified. It redirects her attention to fault finding with herself. What is she not doing enough of? What is she doing wrong? Both of those interventions, or both of those cognitive distortions is the right word for it, deflect responsibility away from the abuser, and she blames herself. Now, that does two things. It corrodes her sense of self, but it also unconsciously preserves the abuser in an idealized state. So it's very much, if she subscribes to ideas that damage and devalue her, she preserves him like he's still wrapped in his Ken doll box from when he came home from the store. And for the time being, like the 8-year-old boy who can't bear to think that daddy is crazy, she needs the abuser to be surrounded with roses. So that is, okay, good. The process of leaving. This is an individual process. It varies from person to person. Generally, this has been researched a lot. Severe abuse predicts leaving. The access to social support and police intervention also helps. And in fact, reliable police intervention is more important than social support. I talked about leaving and coming back, temporary breakups. There are two strategic purposes to these. One is that it startles the abuser into reducing his violence, at least temporarily. So it has an aversive effect on the abuser. He may be more thoughtful, more cautious. The other is think of a baby bird on the edge of a nest flapping its wings, getting stronger. It helps her prepare to make her final break. During this period, there's an or throughout the relationship, intermittent inability or an unwillingness to think clearly about the abuse and what it can lead to. It's just like, I can't think about it, I don't want to think about it. The turning point is when she gets to the point where there may be some catalytic event, like the woman who had her immigration status pulled. She just appalled. She can't believe that he would do that to her. All they've been through and all the, et cetera, et cetera. And that is, now she's really de-idealizing the abuser. And, she still has a foot in both sides of the fence. One is, I love him, I can't live without him, I'll be lost, I'll never find somebody. The other is, that rat bastard, how could he do that to me? And truly hurt and disbelieving. And it's not glib and smart alecky like what I just said. That reappraisal requires that she give up all hope of improvement, that she, sort of de-idealize him, give it up, and that's often followed by depression as a result of having relinquished the idealizations of the abuser. So she has to accept that, for example, he'll never be satisfied with her, he'll never be a reliable father to any children, he'll continue to abuse her regardless of what she does or how she treats him. And there is increasing danger for her psychologically and medically. Often, by the time she gets to the point of relinquishing hope, relinquishing her idealizations, what comes is shame at having tolerated the abuse for so long, a sadness and depression at her wasted efforts. There's the sunk cost that she's finally letting go of, and a residual fear and terror that has been suppressed for years. So she's managed not to feel the fear and terror. When she gives up the idealizations, that's still there. It's a reservoir of fear and terror that begins to leak into the present. And that can show up on ostensibly unrelated things. I'm afraid of getting rear-ended when I stop at a stop sign. I wasn't feeling that way a year ago. And it becomes like a repetitive thought. But that's a bleed-off or a bleed-in of the fear, terror, and anger. The ability to describe the process I just laid out for you doesn't emerge until she's been away from him, out of his presence, and out of contact for months, sometimes as much as a year or two. And I've seen that too, where 3 months later it's like a foot on both sides of the fence. 9 months later it's like, I can't believe how I put up with that for so long, and I'm so ashamed. And then a year and a half later it's like, I'm glad I'm out of there. But it doesn't happen right away. So this is where we can make mistakes too, is, I think that guy's a rat bastard. Don't you agree with me? No. Not now. She might later. So you really have to have your finger on the pulse and not hurry her to agree with your assessment. You may have 2 or 3 layers of assessment, and you may keep them to yourself for the time being as she finds her way, assuming that there's no massive, violent disruption. So, the current and continuing effects on the victim. Denial and minimization, increased reliance on splitting, shame, secrecy, both during and after. Many of the symptoms of PTSD, they may actually meet the criteria for it. Alcohol and substance abuse, I mentioned that earlier. Relapse into alcoholism or coerced relapse by the abuser. How? That's in 2 minutes. I'm really enjoying this. I'm so sorry we didn't have more time. This really is a full-day workshop. I wanted to talk about perpetrators. And I don't want to be glib, but they lie and deny a lot. In terms of therapy, think of it in 2 broad lumps, 2 broad bubbles. The first would be to help him to contain the acting out, to manage his affect, the impulses, to contain the impulses, to help him understand his effect on the people around him. And often you get guys who have made enough progress that they're not violent, but they're still doing all the other snide undermining and making faces, and it's just like without the violence. And for many victims, those are still the cues that activate her fear, even though he's pretty sure he's not going to do anything violent. He stimulates her to fear that something could happen. The second bubble, I'm really running through this, cognitive reorient, this is in the first bubble. Education about entitlement, use of violence, coercion, helping him to develop empathy if he's capable, ownership and accountability. And the other bubble is what most people who are trained psychodynamically want to do right away, which is to get into the family of origin issues, the unresolved damages. The problem with that is if you go too quickly into the abuser's historic trauma, it liberates affect that's been poorly contained, and somebody could get beaten up in 72 hours. So the idea that if you get at the semi-conscious trauma, liberate the affect, that the neurotic condition or psychopathic condition will die on the vine, that's a Freudian concept, and it's good for certain people, it's not good for these people. Getting into the affect puts the battered woman at risk. And so, damn. All right, this has been fun. In spite of all the difficulties of getting here, children may identify with the abuser and have contempt for the battered woman. They may be rageful at her for failure to protect. They may identify with her and have contempt, loathing, and longing for the dad. They may identify with dad and actually adopt some of his behaviors and attitudes and have contempt for their mother. All right. And there is violence in gay and lesbian relationships. One of the early books about that is Violent Betrayal by Claire Renzetti. And the betrayal was lesbians in the 80s thought that they were that their relationships would not be like mainstream hetero relationships. They're not competitive, they're collaborative, they trust each other, and they certainly don't do violence. And so it's this sort of idealized, pure lesbian relationship that doesn't have all the crap you have to deal with in a relationship with men. That's not true. They're competitive with each other, they backbite each other, they try to control each other. And no more than the rest of the population does. It's like that question, do battered women ever lie? Well, of course they lie, about as much as anyone else does. They lie to get out of trouble with their abuser. They lie to the cops and say, oh, he didn't hit me, I walked into a door. And similarly, gay relationships have many of the same problems and the same dynamics. Two things that are very threatening is the threat to out someone without their consent, which activates all kinds of internalized homophobia and activates fear of being marginalized in the mainstream society. So, also, talking about, like for any minority marginalized community, bringing your problems out to the world, the social service agency or the cops, is considered a betrayal of that community. Hence, the immigrant communities don't rely on the cops very much. And that's that. We could talk about the effects on the therapists, which are many, but I think we're really overstaying our welcome. Oh, very quickly, California law. I will get all this stuff to you through PDFs, but you'll be glad to know that if your spouse tries to murder you, they are not eligible for spousal support. Isn't that wonderful?